Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on Registries 101, Advancing Best Practice Guidelines, Methodology, and Innovation. To reduce background noise, the lines will be muted during the presentation. If you have a question during or at the end of the presentation, please enter it in the question and answer box located in your webinar control panel. Presenting today's webinar is Dr. Richard Gliklich and Michelle Leavy. Dr. Gliklich is the CEO of OM1. Previously, he was president of the Outcome Division of Quintiles and the founder, CEO, and chairman of Outcome. Dr. Gliklich is the senior editor of the U.S. Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality Handbook, Registries for Evaluating Patient Outcomes, a User's Guide, and the PI for the Outcomes Measures Framework. He holds several patents for both health outcome systems and medical devices. Dr. Gliklich is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Medical School, a former Charles A. Dana Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, a surgeon at Mass Eye and Ear Infirmary, and the Leffenfeld Professor at Harvard Medical School. Michelle Leavy is Head of Healthcare Research and Policy at OM1, where she oversees projects related to improving patient registry methodology, harmonizing data and outcome measures across patient registries, and using real-world data sources to understand treatment patterns and outcomes. She leads a federally funded effort to harmonize outcome measures across registries and clinical care to support depression research, and she previously managed efforts to develop harmonized outcome measures for use in patient registries under the Outcomes Measures Frameworks project. In addition, Ms. Leavy is the managing editor of Registries for Evaluating Patient Outcomes, a User's Guide. Thank you for presenting today, and I'll now turn over to the both of you.
Great, thank you, Maria, and thank you everyone for joining us today to learn more about patient registries. Our goals today are to spend a few minutes on defining and understanding what we mean by patient registries. We'll then cover some fundamentals of patient registry design, operations, and analysis, with an emphasis on the best practices described in the AHRQ Registries Guide. From there, we'll move on to discussing some recent advances in registry methodology and the uses of registry data. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter any questions into the Q&A box. We've set aside some time at the end to go through those questions and to further discuss the points from the presentation today. And so with that, I think we can move on and start with the definition of a patient registry. So I wanted to start off with a clear definition so that we're all on the same page by what we mean by a patient registry. This definition is from the AHRQ Registries Guide. We first developed this definition back in about 2006 as we were preparing the first edition of the User's Guide, and we've revisited it many times over the years to make sure that it still reflects what we mean by a patient registry. We actually haven't made any changes to it over the years, as it does still reflect the key defining qualities of patient registries. And those qualities are the fact that the data collection efforts use observational study methods. We're collecting uniform data to evaluate specific outcomes. We're doing that in a specific population and for a clearly stated purpose. Those are really the key points about patient registries that differentiate them from other types of healthcare databases. They're purpose-driven, they're focused on that specific population, and they're focused on those specific outcomes of interest. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means as we go through some of those fundamentals about registry design. But before we go into that, I wanted to just take a minute and think also about some of the types of registries that are out there and the traditional uses for registries. Historically, we've seen registries designed to understand the natural history of a disease. This is particularly common in the rare disease space. We've seen many registries designed to look at treatment patterns and outcomes in a particular condition. These are really aimed at understanding the treatment landscape, treatment effectiveness, sometimes comparative effectiveness. Many registries include a focus on safety, particularly in the context of post-marketing safety surveillance for new products. And there's really an entire world of registries aimed at measuring and improving quality of care. Those are just some examples of how registries have been used over the years. And in fact, many registries fulfill multiple purposes. That that flexibility, that ability to meet multiple needs, sometimes within the same registry or in different registries, has led to a lot of interest in developing and using registries, particularly over the last 20 years or so. Since the publication of the first edition of the User's Guide back in 2007, we've seen really tremendous growth in the number of registries that are out there and the ways in which they're being used. And just as a quick example, when we published the User's Guide most recently in 2020, there were about 7,000 registries listed in clinicaltrials.gov with that subtype of patient registry. I took a look this morning, it's up to 10,800. So we're continuing to see that development and growth in the patient registry space. And we're also seeing registries being used for new purposes. So as one example, registries are playing an important role in the move towards patient-centered outcomes research, particularly around efforts to capture patient-reported outcomes so that we can better understand disease burden, quality of life, and other endpoints that are important to patients. Registries can also provide infrastructure for other types of studies, such as pragmatic trials, or in some cases, nested RCTs. And there's really a great deal of interest at the moment in using real-world data from registries and from other sources. Registries can be a very effective way to collect and standardize real-world data to use in a variety of different contexts. And if you go to the next slide, in thinking about registries, we've seen them play a particularly important role here in terms of real-world data and real-world evidence. This has really been since the 21st Century Cures Act a few years ago. Within the FDA's framework for real-world evidence and some of its supporting guidance documents, we've seen registries called out as a potential source of real-world data to support regulatory decision-making. And this has really increased the interest in investment in registries as a potential source of data in this space. What we've also seen is that as there's been more interest in registries as a source of real-world data, there's been a sort of expansion of the role within the context of drug development. Registries have been important for a long time in the context of drug development as a source of information about the natural history of diseases, disease progression, outcomes, and so on. But now they're playing more of a role in informing decision-making about clinical trial design, helping to understand potential endpoints in the pre-market phase, and then later providing data to inform decision-making, potentially regulatory, reimbursement decision-making, and so on. So really a broad role and a number of potential use cases for registries in that context. But at the same time, while we've seen this great growth in registries and have a lot of wonderful examples of how they have been used, there are still problems that come up with the traditional registry model. As registries have evolved over the years, in some cases they've tried to meet many needs for many stakeholders, with the result that they have become more burdensome and more challenging for sites and for patients to participate in. Sometimes this is due to having to do duplicate data entry, or maybe the need to collect additional PROs or other assessments that are not part of routine clinical practice. Sometimes enrollment procedures have maybe gotten complicated. There can be other challenges as well. But the result is that when registries become more burdensome, they're not always able to enroll the broad patient population that was intended. They may, for example, end up with more research-oriented academic sites instead of more community-based sites. That results in a less representative patient population. And really, the result becomes that registries are not providing what we originally intended them to provide. When we think about registries going back several years, the goal was really to provide a real-world view of clinical practice, to let us see what was actually happening in terms of real-world treatment patterns and outcomes, across a range of different care settings, and really to serve as a complement to clinical trials. But what we've seen more recently is that registries have become, in some cases, more like trials, and that's led to this disconnect. So it's a particularly critical thing to think about at the moment as we're exploring how registries can be used to provide real-world data, and at the same time as there's this increasing interest and really need to understand variation in care and outcomes across different patient populations, and when we're trying to increase the participation of underrepresented groups in research efforts. So actually, if you go to the next slide, this has really led to a lot of interest in using other types of data or finding new approaches to make registries less burdensome and go back to that original vision of capturing routine clinical practice and real-world outcomes. But as we do that, it's still critical to keep in mind fundamental registry good practices. How do we do this in a way where we still end up with data of sufficient quality for the intended purpose? So what we're going to do today is focus on those fundamental registry good practices. Our goal is to give everyone a solid understanding of how to design and operate a patient registry. And then we'll spend a few minutes exploring how we can think about some new approaches to registries while still keeping those fundamental good practices in mind. So as we think about registry good practices, we're going to focus on the Registries Guide. This was published by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, originally in 2007 with subsequent editions, most recently in 2020. The Registries Guide is really a widely used publication and really the standard for best practices in the patient registry world. It's been cited by the FDA, by CMS, by many other groups as the standard for registries in the US. If you go to the next slide, we can see some of those specific examples. It's also been used outside the context of government agencies as a reference for how to design, operate, and analyze registries in the US. And then on the next slide, it's also been used globally to set the standard for patient registries, both within the EU as well as through editions that have been published in China and South Korea. And if you go ahead, thank you. So what we, as a global reference and really the standard in the US, the user's guide includes a great deal of information about how to create registries, how to think about the legal and ethical considerations around registries, operating registries, and an evaluation component. And I will say it's a freely available publication. Definitely, I'll cover some key points today, but I definitely encourage you to download a copy. You can access it through the AHRQ website or through PubMed and take a look. There's a lot of information in there. It is intended to be a practical resource. So we've tried to focus on, the nuts and bolts of how does one actually set up, operate, and analyze a patient registry. I'll focus on these first few sections today, and then we'll talk a little bit more about assessing quality, both in the context of data and the results of a registry in a future webinar. I also want to just note before I dive into the content that we had a great deal of participation from authors, reviewers, and case example contributors across a range of different groups. We've had over 200 individuals from academia, government, industry, patient groups, and so on participate over the 4 editions of the user's guide. So we, of course, want to acknowledge their contribution and thank them for their efforts. So since we've talked a little bit already about defining a registry, I wanted to spend some time on the planning phase. Planning for a registry is really an essential component of ensuring that the registry can be successful. One of the great strengths of registries is their flexibility, their ability to meet all of these different purposes. But at the same time, that potential flexibility can be a major pitfall without careful planning. A registry can pretty quickly expand beyond the original purpose and become something that's really unsustainable unless the planning really keeps things on track. Within the user's guide, we've set out this set of steps to go through in terms of planning a registry. The first step around articulating the purpose is really one of the most critical pieces of developing a registry because it drives so many other decisions throughout the life of the registry. Really, the questions around what data do we need to collect, What are we going to do with the data? What sites should we have participating in the registry? All of those questions come back to what is the purpose of the registry? What is it trying to accomplish? It's also really important in this phase to, take a step back and think about, is the registry the right option? So will observational real-world data meet the needs of the stakeholders for this particular question? Has this question already been addressed by other studies? Is there a way to, maybe use some other project that's out there to address the question of interest? We certainly don't want to duplicate efforts within registries. Once you've determined the purpose of the registry and decided that it makes sense to go forward with the registry, the next step is thinking about stakeholders. These can be both internal to an organization who will be involved in the design and development of the registry, but also external stakeholders. What is the audience for the intended results of the registry? Are we going to publish these results? Are they intended to be submitted to a regulatory body? Is the goal to inform reimbursement policies? These are all questions to think about, and then use that to identify who are your stakeholders, and then make sure that you're engaging with them as appropriate, and also thinking about what they are going to need out of the registry. Another key piece here is feasibility and sustainability. So again, in some cases, it's very clear how the registry will be funded and when it will end. In other cases, registries may be more open-ended efforts without a specific end date, in which case definitely need to give some thought to long-term funding plans, what will happen to the data when the registry ends, and so on. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the questions around governance and oversight, so I won't go into that now. And I'll also talk a little bit more about the protocol in a moment. But I do want to take a minute to think about the project plan and how that relates back to the study protocol. And actually, if you can go to the next slide. When we think about the registry design, we're thinking about a lot of different components in terms of the actual analytic plans and study design, the data sources, our patient population, who we want to be in the registry, how we're going to recruit them, and what there might be in terms of potential for bias. All of these questions relate back to the registry purpose. The purpose will be important for the data sources. What data do we need to answer our key questions, and where can we find it? What patients do we need to enroll in order to answer those questions? These are all things that we have to think through in the design phase, and they also relate back to our project plan, where we want to make sure we've thought about what is the timeline for the registry, what is the budget for the registry, who is involved, and how will we communicate findings and decisions about the registry, and really what are the potential risks, what are things that may undermine or cause roadblocks as the registry is moving forward. So all things that need to be thought through in terms of developing the registry protocol, as well as things that need to be thought through in terms of developing a project plan, and really things that relate back to the project management and leadership of the registry. We go to the next slide. It's also important to think about defining our outcome measures for the registry. This is something that we've really drawn attention to in recent years as a way of both identifying the key outcomes of interest for the registry and using that to drive data collection, so that the data collection remains focused and doesn't become too expansive, really. When we're thinking about our outcome measures of interest, we want to be thinking about a number of different areas. We want to be thinking about the types of outcomes that we want to capture here. They might be related to things like survival, disease progression. There might be events of interest, things like hospitalizations. There might be patient-reported outcomes, particularly important in some clinical areas. And we also might want to capture information related to healthcare resource utilization. And then once we've thought about the outcomes we want to capture within those categories, we can work backwards to think about, what are the other things we need to understand so that we can have a good sense of what might be driving those patient outcomes. So what do we need to understand about the patient in terms of their medical history, comorbid conditions, treatments, and so on? What do we need to understand about the particular condition of interest, maybe prior procedures in that area, therapies that they've tried in the past, subtyping for particular conditions, and then what do we need to understand in terms of the practice setting? In some areas that's maybe more important than in others, but it's definitely something to consider. Once we've made those decisions about the outcomes of interest, we can go back and think about how long the study needs to be to collect those particular outcomes, the data we need to calculate those outcomes, and also where those data are coming from, the relevant data sources. So there's an entire chapter around this topic within the user's guide. And I definitely encourage you to take a look at it, as it does help think through all of those different steps around how to define your outcome measures in really a more standardized way. If we go to the next slide, the next component really, as I mentioned, is thinking about the data. Once you have your outcome measures and you have a sense of what you're trying to accomplish, it becomes a question of what do you need to collect and how are you collecting that information? So data elements and data standards. On the data elements side, this is an important step for any registry where we're trying to keep the focus on what is critical for the questions of interest and what is maybe not as important. So certainly thinking through everything you need to understand in terms of the participants, the exposure of interest, the outcomes of interest. The other piece here is really, whenever possible, using established standards, really trying to make it easier to connect data from different registries, connect data to other data sources, aggregate findings, and so on. So, where feasible, trying to use common data elements or clinical data standards. In some disease areas, there are core outcome sets that can be leveraged. So really taking a look at what's out there and seeing if there's anything that you can use in order to make it more feasible to compare and aggregate data in the future. A related topic here is around data sources. So in thinking about, actually, if you can go to the next slide, in thinking about data sources, we've seen more and more effort in recent years to move towards use of secondary data sources within patient registries. So knowing that many of the data elements of interest for registries are already captured in routine clinical practice, how can we access and use that data and not have to go through duplicate data entry? So places where we typically find data of interest for registries are EMRs, claims data, administrative type databases. Sometimes there can be relevant information in other patient registries, and it might be possible to gather some of that information or somehow incorporate it into a new registry effort. We've also seen a lot of interest in recent years around patient-generated health data. So taking information from, example, different types of devices like digital health data and being able to incorporate that into a registry or link it to registry data to support some types of analyses. It's not on the list here, but patient-reported outcomes are another component to think about. They're not really a secondary data source, but just thinking about capturing that information directly from patients. Other potential areas where we might want to gather data are biorepositories, if there's interest in that type of genomic data. Sometimes we're interested in imaging data for particular areas. And then sometimes as we're working with different groups that have data may be stored within clinical data warehouses, or we may need to work through health information exchanges in order to access data from across a regional area. So in thinking about the data sources, we definitely want to understand where the data are coming from, how they were collected, how they might fit within the registry, and what standards may be relevant in terms of those data so that we can incorporate them into a new registry effort. If you go to the next slide, these are some of those key questions, in thinking about our data sources. And it's particularly important, as we start to see more and more registries pull in data from other sources. Really understanding that original purpose of the data collection, as I mentioned, is important. Are these collected for reimbursement purposes, for supporting clinical care? Why were the data captured in the first place? And then also thinking about how, where the data may be found within the data source, whether it's structured data, unstructured data, and thinking about whether we're able to access those data sources, if it's data that was originally collected for a research purpose in the context of maybe another study, do we need additional consent from patients to pull the data into a new study? Is it possible to get a waiver of consent? And so on. And then from an operational standpoint, really thinking about how will those data be incorporated into the registry? How will they be cleaned, standardized, and so on. So a lot of questions to think about in terms of assessing data sources. We'll talk more about some of this in terms of obtaining data and quality assurance. If we go to the next slide, this actually links well into the thought about secondary data sources, but just generally, thinking about registries in terms of the ethical framework for conducting this type of registry, thinking about protecting patient privacy, and so on. I'm not going to go through this chapter in detail because it contains, really a great deal of information and could be its own webinar to go through these components. But this particular chapter within the user's guide is a great resource for better understanding the ethical and patient privacy aspects of registry-based research. We go through a lot of information here in terms of understanding the common rule and how it relates to registries, thinking through other relevant legislation like HIPAA and high-tech and so on. And then also thinking about some concepts related to registry transparency and data ownership, all of which are important both in the planning phases and throughout the operational phase of a patient registry. And actually the next slide just gives a little bit more of an example of how this chapter gets into really the details here. This particular table summarizes the privacy rule and the common rule requirements as they apply to patient registries. And so you can see how factors that determine those requirements are around the registry developer, the purpose of the registry, and the extent to which the registry data elements are identifiable. So really, a very useful framework for understanding the context in which patient registries operate and getting a feel for what those requirements may be. Related to that is the topic of informed consent. And this is actually another area where there can be a lot of variations in how registries, whether registries are capturing informed consent or whether there's a waiver of informed consent. It really comes back to the registry purpose, the types of data, how the data are being collected. And really, registries are quite different than clinical trials in this sense. And so it's helpful, I think, to understand the background around where informed consent is necessary for registries, where it may not be required, where we can request a waiver or an alteration of informed consent. And then in the cases where we are getting informed consent, how is that consent different from what we might see in a clinical trial? Given that registries are capturing observational data about routine clinical care, a registry-informed consent is going to spend more time focusing on the use of the registry data. What are we going to do with that data? How are we going to potentially link it? What is the purpose of the data collection? Can we recontact participants at any point? What happens to their data if they withdraw from the registry? What are the privacy and security considerations? Those are the areas where we typically see an informed consent for a patient registry focus, as opposed to some of the language that you may see in a more typical clinical trial consent. They are often shorter as well because there is a different focus. This chapter gives a particularly helpful list of elements that should be considered when creating an informed consent for patient registries, and then also lays out those frameworks for when it may be possible to collect a waiver of informed consent and when patient consent is most likely going to be required. Related to these topics around ethics and informed consent are also the concepts around registry governance. Registry governance is something that all registries have. It really can vary in terms of how governance is structured, whether it is completely within the core registry team or whether there are external participants in the governance process. Governance refers generally to that structure or plan for managing the registry and guiding decision making. In some registries, we do see that happens within the core registry team. Other registries may have advisory boards, external advisory boards, other types of groups that provide input and help inform decision making. It's another area where it depends largely on the scope of the registry, the stakeholders who are participating, the intended uses for the data. And really it can vary. Some registries may have a very active advisory board component during the initial design phase to help shape the design and data collection elements. Some registries may continue that throughout the duration of the registry. Other registries may really have an operational phase and then pull that group back together towards the end to help guide dissemination and outreach strategies. So there are a lot of different ways that governance can work within a registry content or a registry context. Really one of the most important principles that we've emphasized within the content in the user's guide is that governance should be decided upon and documented upfront so that everyone is clear on how decisions are made for the registry, and those decisions are documented going forward. So really that transparency piece is a key theme throughout this particular chapter. We go on to the next slide. This is an area where it's incredibly important for registry success. We can have a wonderful registry design and really great scientific objectives, but if we don't have the patients and participants in the registry, we're not going to get anywhere. So hard to overstate how important this is in terms of actually making sure the registry is successful. It's also, I think, one of the most challenging areas of registry design and operations, both in terms of setting up a realistic plan and knowing how to go about this, and then also throughout the registry, just continually monitoring and making sure that this stays on track so that we don't lose participants. When we think about registries, we can think about recruitment at different levels. In some cases, we're recruiting what we sometimes call clinical sites, maybe a hospital, a particular practice setting. Sometimes we're enrolling individual clinicians to participate. Sometimes we're directly enrolling patients. Sometimes patients are being enrolled by their providers. So there's a lot of different ways that recruitment happens. And there's a lot of different reasons why people decide to participate in a registry. At the clinician level, clinicians might be interested in participating because it's really a relevant topic for their patient population and they want to contribute to this project. In some cases, there might be real interest in being part of publications, being part of the research process. Patients also, may, in cases where patients are being asked to consent to participate, they might want to participate to, share information about their perspective, to help shape, treatment or help support development of new therapies in a particular area. One of the ways to develop an effective recruitment and retention strategy is to think carefully about who you want to participate and why they may participate, and then try to align both the messaging about recruitment as well as any incentives so that those so that registry participation is attractive to those groups. It's also, I think, a common challenge where we think a lot about how to get people interested in the registry and involved at the beginning, and spend less time thinking about how to keep them engaged in the registry for the duration. And they are equally important. We want to make sure that we're clear up front about what's involved in registry participation so that people know what to expect and know what they're signing up for, and also make sure that throughout the registry duration, we continue to provide support for questions, information, make them feel like they're part of something meaningful, keep them, up to date about publications and so on, address questions. We want to make sure that retention is equally important. Then the last point I'll make here is that this is an area where having clear metrics is very important. How many sites do we need? How many patients do we need? How long do we have to keep them in the study? Monitoring retention, just really keeping track so that we can immediately understand when there's a potential problem and take steps to address it. I'm not going to talk in detail about the next couple of topics because they're really, I think, topics better suited for a deeper dive look at in a future webinar, but definitely important to think about questions around how you're getting data and data quality assurance, adverse event detection and processing and reporting is also a really important topic for some registries depending on the purpose. This is a great chapter that gives a lot of information about that, and certainly something we can talk about more in the future. From an analysis standpoint, we really want to emphasize, I think, the importance of thinking through what you intend to do with the data and developing that statistical analysis plan. It's an important step to make sure that you're capturing the data that you need, that you've thought through the potential challenges and issues with the data, and you have the relevant information as we're thinking about confounding variables and so on. And then on the interpretation side, really making sure there's good documentation around, who did we intend to enroll, who did we actually enroll, how were the data collected, how did we do things, how did we handle loss to follow-up patients, how did we address missing data in the data set, how were the analyses performed, and so on. All of those pieces will be important for disseminating the results of the study and really getting the word out through publications, abstracts, or whatever other means are appropriate for a particular registry. The last section of the user's guide focuses on the assessment of the quality of the research methods and the evidence. This is where we have some very detailed criteria. We emphasize a fit-for-purpose approach, really meaning that you should evaluate the registry in the context of the intended purpose of the registry and its data. I won't go into it in detail today, but definitely something we'd like to come back and focus on in the future. But instead, I want to just go back and think about that original question. So we've talked through a lot of the elements of registry good practice, and I think now we want to be able to think about how can we take those elements of good practice and create a registry that's still feasible, that's still efficient, that can enroll that broad patient population and be successful without running into some of those problems with the traditional registry model that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to turn it over to Rich now to talk a little bit more about those concepts.
Great, thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about registry automation. And And this is just one topic that we're just going to go into a quick, I'd say a taste of it, and then we'll get to Q&A. But I want you to give us an understanding of what Michelle was speaking about with respect to the evolution of patient registries, this period of time where they became too trialized, and now sort of the emergence from that, where we're really relying, or good registries are relying on automation to improve their value and make them now really the cornerstone of real-world evidence. And I'll talk about that in a second as well. So this is a slide Michelle showed you earlier around problems with traditional registry. And the only aspect I'm really going to focus on is the second and the third, which are related. Where registries have too much stuff that a clinician, a participant, a caregiver needs to do, that leads to burden. It leads to potentially bias in enrollment. And the bias in enrollment comes from both certain patients not being willing to participate, but also providers, as they're working in their busy day, may start excluding certain patients who they think are going to take too long. And we have lots of data to support this issue. And so this kind of leads us to this concept of how do you leverage secondary data sources as a primary component and complement to what we'd call active data collection. So we think about active data collection, that which you must collect because it doesn't otherwise exist, and passive data collection, that which you can benefit from already there being high quality information that's collected, and through linkage and connection, we can reduce burden. So that's the concept behind automation. And when we think about where can we automate to make a difference, this is the pictorial I like to use to describe every registry, right? We enroll patients with certain levels of risk factors. We do some sort of sampling. Ideally, we enroll everyone, so we avoid sampling. And then we collect information at different settings of care, at enrollment, during ongoing treatments, and looking at intermediate outcomes, and finally at some summary outcome, which could be 3 years from now, or it could be 10 years from now in a registry that's looking at malignancy or infection with a new biologic, for example. So these are where we think about it. So where does automation apply? Well, the answer is automation can apply everywhere, right? We can use automation, as Michelle described, with leveraging waiver of informed consent so that we can avoid sampling if we're able to use automation combined with de-identification to convince an IRB that there's minimal risk. We can enroll potentially every patient who qualifies. And we can use automation to obtain follow-up information from medical record systems that exist within centers. And even with patient consent, we can go out to 5,000 connected centers in the United States to pull medical record information. We can combine registry active information with data that we're capturing from claims and other sources that give us more information than we just get from the single provider and that we've entered the registry through, like we typically picking a center, a specialty, or specialist. But we want to get often that broader context of what that healthcare resource utilization and patterns are. Those are the things that we can do with automation. It really starts with connecting to the systems of record, and we'll have other webinars to go into this in more detail. But the systems of record, I mean, are the electronic medical record systems, so the EPICs and the Cerners and the Allscripts that can be connected to and leveraged. Things like tumor registries and laboratory systems and pathology systems, which are considered the accurate information, right? When we go with a traditional registry and bring that to a site, they're often extracting or abstracting that information from the medical record to complete it. Why have that step if we can actually go to the source and connect it, pull it in a more efficient and more cost-effective way? And then we're able to take that type of information and clean and normalize it, because ultimately we've got to take the spaghetti that represents all of the medical record systems out there, which are all different, have different data models, to combine them into a common data model and track that information traceably from source into the data. But those things can now be accomplished technologically. And so now we start to think, what can we get from the EMR? And therefore, can we skip having to actively collect that? And we can do this in a way that's regulatory compliant because we can follow data through its transformations in a traceable way. And one of the key aspects of that data is the unstructured medical record. And this could be, again, a topic for a separate conference. But as any of us who have requested our medical records and reviewed them know, that the key information is not in the structured information that we see on our patient portal, but it's actually in reviewing the note, that clinical narrative. That's where information is placed. And the wonderful changes that have occurred over the past 9-10 years in terms of ability to process unstructured data, think about ChatGPT and what that all means, is the ability to extract structured information into the case report forms that you think of in terms of a registry design, using technology and being able to validate that and being able to capture information that is really detailed and valuable that you would otherwise ask. Things like symptoms, and this is just example from records in lupus, symptoms and medications and adverse events to medications and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that are now possible to augment the data being collected and dramatically reduce burden, and to be able to do it in a traceable, validated, and compliant way through both this language processing to extract unstructured information and something we could talk about another day, which is estimation of endpoints from clinical narratives. Of course, when we do this, particularly when we're using registries to support, say, a post-marketing commitment or even an external control arm, we have to be able to validate those algorithms that do this, that extraction. And then what we really want to do, again, is close the loop on what data we need to actively collect. And so there's a whole world of additional information. You can just see this one example from the United States of a very large data set that represents the majority of people in the United States. Not all of the data, but certain areas where there's data we wouldn't even be necessarily known to the provider or even potentially to the patient, meaning things like medical and pharmacy claims records that can be linked in, information about death. So we struggle in healthcare to be able to capture death information because patients' death does not necessarily get recorded in the medical record, but it gets recorded in the death indices, it gets recorded in the obituaries, and that information can be pulled in. Provider information, so we understand practice patterns as they reflect and impact patient outcomes, because there's a direct effect, so we can control for that in our analyses. And things like social determinants of health and economic status, race, ethnicity, income level, and so on. Just examples of where not only do we fill in data so we don't have to collect it, but we get more richness in the information as we try to go forward. And that enables us to limit active data collection to that which just needs to be collected. So that which needs to be collected is that which doesn't get recorded in the medical record or in these other sources. And that's typically in a registry clinician reported outcomes. So in dermatology and psoriasis, that might be a PASI, a score called a PASI, which is not generally recorded, or in stroke, it may be the NIH stroke scale. So there may be very specific things we then collect, as well as patient-reported information, and then link that. So we now turn that design approach that Michelle was talking about around. And so when we start with the design, we say, what's fit for purpose for your registry's needs? So as you go through that design process as to what data is fit for purpose, you're going to be thinking about all of these things in this word cloud. And you're going to be thinking about, what are the exposures and what do I need to know about them? And what are the outcomes and what are the adverse events? But what I want you to start thinking about, and we'll talk about this in other presentations, is it available in the medical record or other systems? For example, can we capture images and obtain that information? Again, electronic data, we can pull that, process that, and avoid the burden. And you start seeing some of the things that we know already in the EMR, because we abstract the EMR for a lot of these registries currently. Past history and capturing certain outcomes, understanding exposures and family history, understanding demographics and comorbidities. And if it's not in the EMR, can it be obtained through linkage to other sources? So we're doing some work around conditions that affect the Medicare population. There, we access Medicare claims data and can learn a tremendous amount through linkage to claims data, especially about patients who may go to other places for their care. And then finally, are there discrete clinician or patient-reported information that's still needed? So we flip the model and we say, what can we collect on our list of data elements that we need for our design from what's available passively? And then let's just focus on the discrete clinician or patient-reported information that's still needed. So that's the model that I believe registries are moving to. And the ones that do this benefit both from a burden perspective, bias perspective, as well as a cost perspective. Two last comments. So regulatory compliance has been mentioned. I point to these examples of some guidances, but the left guidance that you see is specific for assessing registries to support regulatory decision-making. And the far right guidance is the most recent guidance, actually signals to me that in many ways, registries are going to be foundational for any type of real-world evidence that will be submitted to the FDA. It will really be part of that hybridized approach to data collection because of the requirements that are there, traceability, transparency, and auditability that a registry can provide, and some of these secondary data sources alone cannot. Three quick examples. So one is using registry as an evidence development platform. This is a neurodegenerative disease, the registry model enables us to follow 10,000 patients. Data is collected retrospectively in an ongoing way. A number of sub-studies are layered on top of this. Patients interact directly with the platform. Providers get quality metrics through the platform as well. And so this becomes both an automated and leverageable network that includes some patient and clinician direct entry and some automated collection from medical records. Another example here is using registries for post-marketing commitments. Again, this approach that, the concept of using a registry is not new for post-marketing commitments, but we start seeing how we could get to scale, where now this is a program leveraging a registry that has 25,000 patients. Again, by leveraging a combination of all of the things that Michelle talked about, plus this concept of automation. And then we can get even bigger. So these are programs in women's health, two registry types of programs in terms of being observational data, each with approximately 1 million people involved. One as a platform for publications, the other as a platform for submission to the FDA. So those are the things I wanted to touch on. And with that, I want to thank everyone for listening. We have a few minutes to go through some questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Gliklich and Ms. Leavy. As a reminder to our audience, if you have a question, please enter it in the question box located in your webinar control panel. We've had some questions come in during the presentation, so I'll start with those first. Okay, first question. How do you view this new approach to registries, and how can this feed into hybrid designs?
Yeah, I'll tackle that if that's okay, Michelle. It's really interesting. I was at the ICP conference a couple weeks ago, and Rob Califf, the commissioner of the FDA, was actually talking specifically about hybridized designs for reducing burden. So I think that every registry has to be evaluated for the opportunity for automation, but they have to be designed that way as well, right? So if you're going to create a registry to meet trial needs, trial type of data collection, it's probably not going to match well. But if it's really focused on getting broad populations representative, large amounts of data that can be leveraged to answer questions, I think it should be evaluated for every registry going forward.
Thanks. Second question, is it possible to link these registries to global data outside the US in a compliant way?
It's difficult. The privacy rules differ from the US to Europe. even to Canada. And so you lose certain things as you try to link, but it's one question may be what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to increase the places that you're bringing data in from, certainly you can run a registry in multiple countries and bring the data together. It's just the automation techniques that we're able to use in the US are still less, not available, but less available than they are in the US.
Thank you. If your question was not answered or you have one following the webinar, please submit it to us directly and we will follow up with you. Thank you again for joining today's webinar. A link to the recording will be distributed to all attendees and we hope you'll join us again in the future. Thank you.